There are over 50 Japanese maples in the Seattle Japanese Garden, representing over 24 different varieties. These trees provide a crucial element of structure, and their changing colors almost define seasonality. As part of the highly intentional, highly curated nature of this garden, these trees are all pruned regularly with extreme care and intention. Today, we will share some of the tips and techniques that we employ in the maintenance of these treasured parts of the garden. The most important consideration for pruning and maintaining these trees is to respect and highlight their natural beauty. The graceful, arching branches and delicate, lacy foliage are natural features of these trees. We, as gardeners, do not create them. We emphasize and celebrate them. Japanese maples used in gardens are naturally forest understory and forest edge trees. They thrive in dappled shade and shallow, rich soil. There are hundreds of varieties with variations in leaf texture, form, color, and size. This variety attests to their long-standing popularity, as well as the adaptability of the species. The growth habit of Japanese maples generally fall into two broad categories, upright and horizontal. Today's subject is one of our most prominent trees, the large horizontal maple that greets visitors immediately inside our entry gate. Pruning consists of three primary elements: deadwood removal, reducing congestion, and clarifying and refining form. Deadwooding seems obvious, but in many cases, simply cleaning out a neglected tree can provide great results. It is also vital to actually see the form and assess the health of the tree. Careful, detailed deadwooding provides a fantastic opportunity to observe the tree, its individual habits, and growth. Selecting and removing parallel branches, branches that grow back into the interior, and branches that crowd out other branches is the purpose of thinning. This can be accomplished through the removal of a small number of large branches or a larger number of very, very small branches or twigs. It is often through a combination of both. This is the technique that is most helpful in showing off the structure and grace of the tree. It also requires a great deal of care, as over-thinning can result in a tree with a hollow, two-dimensional shell, poor branch structure and taper, or very unattractive and unhealthy regrowth. Clarifying or refining form includes reduction of new tip growth back to a suitable side branch, or the removal of other branches to help refine or define the shape and scale of the tree. This is the most nuanced technique and requires extreme caution. The resulting reactive regrowth can ruin the beauty and health of the tree. One of the people who taught me used to talk about washing the trees, and the idea of just kind of going through and just kind of lightly pulling out a few things here and there rather than going in and doing this level of detail. So a lot more of the bigger trees especially kind of get washed. And then these trees get very detailed, picking out each and every to the point where we're almost deciding where each leaf is.
And this is a good season to do the pruning for maples?
Yeah, well, if the trees are healthy and irrigated, yes. If the trees are stressed right now, this isn't a good time. Our trees are healthy, they're irrigated. I like doing it at this time because they're not going to grow back. They won't resprout like they would if you did it in the spring or earlier in the summer. So and this is just before the color changes, which is sort of their, that's their big time to shine here in the garden. So make them look as good as they can for that, just so that they don't, give them a really nice, get them camera ready for their big show.
So what are you focusing on right now?
All the way through, what I'm trying to do is really encourage a little bit of space between the leaves and the branches here. And so, I'm favoring branches that are more horizontal and shorter versus the longer and either upright or down branches, so that we have this sort of soft open layering. I want to be careful not to just strip everything out though, because then you end up with these very bare branches that have a poop on the end. That's not very good looking and also not very good for the tree. So it's a little bit about trying to find that balance. The typical growth pattern for something like this is that the branches grow off from the sides.
Okay.
And then the single branch goes on the middle. What often will happen is that one of those two side branches will become weak and die off. So I will generally start to kind of push that, make that happen sooner. And so I'll remove one of three. So in many cases, you'll notice on here that the branches are now dividing from one branch to two branches, and again into splitting into two, into two, instead of into three, four, or more than that, and also not just one branch all the way through. So it's that kind of bifurcation, splitting, that gives you that really nice open, tapered branch structure that we're looking for here. And then some cases there's just branches that are growing a little bit too long, or branches that are going back towards the center. And so getting rid of those so that we continue with this sort of natural, healthy outward growth.
I see.
You see something like this where it's a really, something that's kind of growing back towards the middle and it's kind of long to take that back to something here. So now we're redirecting that growth.
Do you go step back and then see it and that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Do you do that too?
it's important to step back. I mean, at this point though, it's so slow that it may take a long time. Also with these kind of, especially these lace leaf or the kind of horizontal or weeping maples, you do most of your work from the inside, and then you'll step out and you'll see one or two things to adjust, but 90% of your work is happening, on this inside of it.
What about things like this, like coming out, like a thin branch coming out from the big?
Some of those are going to leave because, again, we don't want to have everything stripped out and bare. We don't have these really bare branches with nothing on them. Really, really small ones, like little tiny, just 2 or 3 leaves, usually will come out. And the same thing will happen here where if the branches are growing back towards the inside, I want to kind of control them so that we're getting another middle layer inside here. Partly that means that it will kind of protect the trunk from really hot sun or really cold breezes. And partly it's so that visually when you're looking at the tree, you see layers of leaves inside of it. It doesn't just have this kind of 2-dimensional shell form. You really want to make it 3-dimensional, much deeper looking. So by leaving the branches here, or by leaving this in here, and then thinning here, you look into it and you see it. It's got more shadow and more depth, but it's also got, it's not just a stripped out hollow space.
Right, makes sense.
Then I don't really try to, I'm not doing too much to raise the height on this one any more than just what makes sense for the tree.
Oh, okay.
This one is something where people are always going to walk underneath it, so we do some management of that to prevent it from getting all the way to the ground.
Okay, so I think for the novice people, it's difficult to judge what's the right length.
Yeah.
How do you have any tips for that?
Just looking for what seems out of scale. So if you have a branch that's on one of the tips over here that's growing out, let's see if I can find an example of that. So I guess you could take, I'm not really seeing any really good, okay. If there's a branch here, for instance, that's really long at the tip, you can shorten it back to the next growth point, the next little branch that's there. And that way you now don't have that length that's coming out here that will make it look awkward and shaggy.
Oh, okay.
It kind of keeps it back within that profile. It's not about making it shorter, it's just about making it fitting to the rest of the tree. So if you have any other twig that is a really long shoot that's grown out, we'll remove that, but not because it's too long for the tree, not too long just as a general rule.
Okay.
Again, looking at it from outside, it's, there's a little bit to remove to kind of clear up some of the some of that. But really, the idea is I want to see some branches, some leaves all the way through. I don't want to see just all dense leaves or just bare branches anywhere. I like the whole idea to be just sort of this open lace work that kind of gives you a chance to really experience the depth of the tree. Then if you step back and look at it, you'll see the overall shape of the branches better. And then as you get closer, you get to see more and more of the detail.
Nice. What's the tip that you can give when to stop?
When to stop. So the most you'll ever want to take off of any tree is 25% of the leaves. And that's the most that you ever want to take off. So always aim for way lower than that. So basically if you take off, 1 out of every 5 or 6 leaves that you see on the branches by cutting off the small branches, that will leave you enough balance. Also, be really careful that you're not, same thing with pines where the majority of the growth is going to happen in the upper section of the tree.
Oh, okay.
The lower branches are going to tend to be less vigorous. So plan accordingly based on how much you're going to remove. You're going to take off a lot more, at the very top branches there. When I get down to the bottom here, it's really small stuff.
Oh,
so starting at the inside and top and working your way down is how I'll do these, right? So if you look, I kind of started up here and I've been working my way down this branch. Shake it out sometimes because you do get a lot of your clippings get stuck in there. So that can actually confuse you if you see the branches and you think it's really dense and full still, but it's mostly stuff you've already cut out. So you need to stop and comb it occasionally too.
Like you said, this is a very healthy tree, so you can prune right now. Do the gardener easily identify which trees is too stressed or weak?
Yeah, if the tree is already starting to change color this early in the year, it's usually stressed. If the tree didn't put on very much new growth in the spring, it's stressed. If the tree is kind of, has branch or has leaves that are starting to get crunchy or crispy along the edges, it's stressed this time of year, and I wouldn't do any pruning on it. But also, if this tree was in full sunlight, if it didn't have, this has shade in most of the day, you can get away with a little bit more. If the tree is in full baking sunlight all day, you don't want to prune as much because it's not going to recover as fast from that stress. It's just too hot and too sunny. So it's all based on what you have and where you have it.
Where the locations and everything.
So. Also, for the homeowner, the person who's got their own garden at home, rather than thinking about doing all their pruning at one time, they can do a little bit at a time throughout the course of a year. It's a lot less stressful. It's a lot easier for them because then they don't have to commit to like a day of doing all this work. They can do a little bit today, they can do a little bit next week, they can do a little bit over the course of time and just sort of watch the response too. So if you take your time with it and you're not feeling like it has to be done today, it allows you an opportunity to say, well, I'm not sure, I might come back and do this later. You can always come back and do it later. You can't put it back once you cut it off. So,
that's true. So one time my husband actually pruned. We did not know anything about pruning, but we have a maple trees in front of the door, near the front door. And then he's engineer, so he didn't do it natural look. So it looked like, it looked so ugly after we did it. Is there like any tip for not so much of a bigger tree, but then the smaller tree, and then the through the summer, the branch grew, new branches grew. How do you trim that type of maple tree?
For something like that, the maples are usually really vigorous trees. Actually, in spite of their very delicate leaves and delicate looking, they grow very vigorously. So most of the time when you prune them wrong, they grow back too vigorously. And that's what you get, where life shoots are going everywhere and they're going straight up. If you leave them alone for a year or two, those branches that are going straight up will start to get heavy and then they'll start to lay down. And then what you can do is start selecting out 2 or 3 of them that you like the best and keep them and remove
Which
one or
ones
two that are not as good. The ones that are still too, if you cut them, if they've been cut really bad and they're stubby and they have a bunch of sprouts on them, you may remove a larger branch and leave the new branch that's grown in that's healthier naturally.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of times that's what happens is you get, a tree that's been malpruned and you have to do some renovation, but the biggest part of renovation is just the not pruning it for a year.
Oh,
just don't do anything, just let it grow
just
out because it needs to get something that is, if you keep cutting it back to that same form, you're going to have the same problem.
Oh wow, yeah, that's a good tip. Needs a patience.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jessa. I'm the programs manager for the Seattle Japanese Garden, and I am the moderator for today's Q&A with Pete Putnicki, our senior gardener, who you just watched beautifully prune the lace leaf maple at the entry of the Japanese garden. Before we start with our Q&A, I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsor for this Kaleidoscope series of virtual events, the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. We are so thankful to be working with them, and it's really great to be able to put on this type of event, which is very different than anything we've done before at the garden. A high quality recording of this webinar will be available on the Seattle Japanese Garden's YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit this content in the future, it will be available in the next few days. Pete, do you want to introduce yourself before we get started with the questions?
Thanks, Jessa. My name is Pete Putnicki. I'm the senior gardener at the Seattle Japanese Garden. So thank you all for coming to this. Yes, today.
And Pete, you've been the senior gardener for almost 5 years now?
Yeah, almost 5 years, and I've been working with the garden as a subcontractor with for a number of years before that. So I've got a history there going back about 8 or almost 9 years now. So
amazing.
Yeah, professional gardener for a long time.
That's awesome. So we have some really good questions that people have come up with already in the comments, and everyone please feel free to ask more. There is no question too complex or too simple. I say we might come across one. So just to start out, Sandy has asked, should one ever remove big branches if you find a tree creating too much shade in your yard?
The removal of big branches is possible. It makes sense sometimes to do that. I wouldn't typically remove the tree because of the shade that it's creating, though, especially on a Japanese maple, where the point of what you want that tree to do in your garden is to actually provide shade for what's underneath it. You might remove a large branch if it's damaged, or if there's mechanical problems, or if it's causing other difficulties with your driveways or walkways. But as far as shade, I think it's probably going to be better served by doing a general thinning on the tree rather than the removal of just one large branch for that. As far as the removal of large branches, there's been some other questions about timing. I think that that's the kind of work that you're going to want to do during the dormant season, during the time between December through January. Part of that is that it's going to give you a complete new season to seal over and cover up that wound, and you'll be able to kind of watch it react to the next year. If you did that kind of large branch pruning this time of year, it would be very stressful for the tree, and then it would be sitting there with an open wound through the fall when there's more fungus sporing out. So you're going to be more likely to start getting decay in the tree.
Great. Pete, before we move on to the next question, could I encourage you to maybe move a little closer to your mic,
Sure.
because people are having some trouble hearing you.
I hope, is this better at all?
It's a little better. It's better. It's still a little choppy, but
okay. I'll try to slow down. Or...
Yeah, I think we should be good. Thank you. So just in case anyone had trouble hearing that, what I got, and feel free to elaborate or correct me, was that it's generally, if you're taking a dead branch off a tree, or sorry, if you're taking a branch off a tree, it should be because it's dead or because there's a mechanical issue with the branch.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. You're going to get better thinning to give you that sort of reduction of shade would be better accomplished by thinning, a removal of a lot of small branches versus a removal of one large.
Great. Okay. So another question that we have here is from Nancy. What are your suggestions for starting with a tree that hasn't been trimmed in many years? It generally has a nice shape, but it's very thick and needs a lot of work.
Okay. The first and easiest thing to do is going to be deadwood. So if it's a horizontal or weeping maple, you're going to basically crawl underneath it, and you're just going to start breaking out and cutting out and removing all of those little fine dead twigs, as many of them and as fine detailed as you can get with that. After doing all the deadwooding, making sure that everything that doesn't have any leaves on it, all the little branches that are turning gray, the branches that are very brittle and easy to break because they're dead, remove all of that, and then clean up and take a look at what you've got. You may be mostly done at that point. A tree that has been unpruned is almost always going to look better than one that's been malpruned, because you're not trying to recover something that has grown back awkwardly. The tree naturally grows as graceful as it can. We emphasize that form by pruning, but its natural growth habit is going to be the most attractive form that's going to get. So not pruned is probably going to be a much, much prettier tree than a poorly pruned tree. But deadwood would be my first step, and then a little bit of reduction and thinning, but you'd be surprised at what cleaning out deadwood would do for a neglected maple.
Follow-up question on pruning neglected trees. Would it be easier to prune a tree after the leaves have fallen off, so you can see the form of the tree and the dead branches more easily?
Absolutely. You know, like in the video, there's a little mention that any time of the year is the right time for deadwooding. It's just a really, you know, during the summer you can do it because it's not growing and you can see what's dead really easily. Pruning a neglected tree in the wintertime is great too, because if you end up needing to make some large cuts, if there's some branches that are damaged or more significant reshaping the tree on the tree, you can do that during the dormant season, and you're kind of working within the right time of the year for the tree. So winter pruning is great. And in many, many cases, that's all you need. We prune the trees in our garden because, like I said, we want them to really look their best for fall color. And part of that is to have them cleaned up, you know, in September, so that by the beginning of October, they're really, really pretty.
It's true. This is the most popular time for people to visit the garden every year. Normally, we're doing our Maple Festival this time of year, which unfortunately we cannot do. But it's still a really nice time to visit if you can get a reservation. So speaking of pruning, there are a couple questions from several people about what you should do after you've pruned a branch. Should you seal it in any way, or are you concerned about things like sun scald, or, oh, sorry, are you concerned about things like fungal infection? And I'll ask the sun scald question separately.
Sure. Sealing the tree, unfortunately, is not really that helpful. You tend to, at that point, trap more inside than you would. The use of pruning sealants is kind of no longer recommended for in current arboriculture, because you do tend to trap more inside. there's also questions about whether or not you should sterilize or clean your tools for trees. Again, you're working in an outdoor environment. You're not working in a laboratory. So you can't really control what is and what isn't happening. Ideally, you're going to get the best results for disease control by managing your timing. So again, not pruning in the spring and not making a lot of large cuts in the fall. So by pruning again during the middle of the winter, the dormant season, there's very, very little sporing. Fungus is sporing at that time of year. And it's just before the new season's growth starts. So it allows the tree to seal over those wounds so that the new growth comes out quicker than doing it in the fall.
And is there anything in particular about pruning in the rain?
You know, I've heard people say that that's not a great idea, but then it's going to rain eventually, and it's going to get rain onto those wounds. It's also really important that when you're pruning to make clean cuts, not to leave jagged wounds, tear the bark. So as a demonstration here, if you are to do something on this.
Pete, I can't hear you when you move. Sorry. Away.
So if it's broken off or cut not cleanly, you end up with a very rough space here where you might potentially have more fungus and decay being able to get in. Using sharp, clean tools, you're able to make a cut it's a cleaner cut that will allow the tree to grow over and seal that wound more effectively on it. So clean, sharp tools are probably more important than any of the other issues that you're going to deal with as far as, and clean, sharp tools and timing are probably the most important things you can do for disease prevention.
Pete, I've had the joy of attending one of your maple pruning lessons in person in the past, and at that time you mentioned the value of straight cuts versus diagonal cuts, and I have the feeling this audience may also be interested in that.
Sure. So just do a quick line on the board over here to explain the difference here. If you're cutting a branch, and I know that you're not going to be able to hear, probably even see this. Can't really see that, can you? All right.
Not particularly, sorry.
We'll try something else. So when you're making a cut, your ideal cut of an exposed surface.
Pete, I can't hear you.
You want to have as small of an exposed surface area as possible when you make a cut. So cutting at a really steep angle. See how much surface area is exposed there? As compared to cutting directly across, you have a much smaller surface area. Does that make sense?
I think so.
What that's going to do is that's going to allow this new ring of growth. You know, as trees grow each year, they put on a new ring of bark or new growth, right? That's going to allow this to cover up and seal this wound quicker than if it was a jagged or angled cut.
Great. So I'm going to step it back with levels of complexity here and go to a simpler question. What are some good varieties of Japanese maples that grow well in this area?
We're really lucky in this area that almost all of them grow here well. We have mild summers, mild winters, plenty of rain. We have, you know, more rain in the winter than in the summer, which doesn't really affect them that much. So I personally have a real preference for just a straight species as compared to the named varieties. I think that a lot of the named varieties that are out there, they have a lot of interesting features, but the specific features will sometimes detract from the overall quality of the tree. I'm a big fan myself, like I said, of just straight unnamed maples. There's the Koto no Ito is one variety that we have a few of at the garden that are gorgeous if you're looking for a really thin, tiny leaf, or not tiny leaf, very, very, leaves really thin, like stringy almost. On the other end of that, the Acer japonicums, the full leaf maples, they grow really well here too, and those are round full leaf. So honestly, it's kind of up to you. Being kind of going back to this though, the idea is that you want to make sure that the maple that you select is going to look right in the place that you're putting it. So having a tree with really fine texture, far in the back of your garden where you never actually see that fine texture is kind of not really going to help you any more than having something with a very coarse texture and really big, bold leaves right by your window may not be the right choice. So I would say look around, see some trees that you like, and make a decision. They all do well here, though. We are very, very fortunate in the Pacific Northwest.
Great. Okay, so we have a couple different questions about moving trees from pots into the ground. So I think the first one is, what's the best time to transfer a tree?
So transplanting, again, fall is great for that. So getting them in the ground sometime right after the leaves fall, actually. So, you know, early November while the ground is still wet and soggy and easy to dig before it freezes. And then the tree can sit all winter getting watered and all winter being kind of cool and relaxing in there. And then when spring comes and that new growth pushes, it's really going to get a chance to dig those roots in, the new roots that are going to start growing in spring as well. Try not to move stuff in the middle of the summer. It's just too hot. It's just stressful and it's going to be too much trouble for you to keep it watered. So fall for transplanting, if you can get away with it, that's really the best time to do it.
Okay. And when should you start pruning or trimming trees into shape? Should you start when they're very small in the pot, or should you wait until they're in the ground?
So I'm not really, we're not really trying to trim the trees into shape. We're just trying to emphasize or accentuate the shape they naturally have. Mm-hmm. You can do a little bit of that while they're still in the pot, but because the transplanting and planting of the tree is going to be a stressor itself, you're going to add that stress to the stress of pruning. So I'll typically wait until the tree has been in the ground for about a year before I do anything. Just put it in the ground, let it grow out for a while. The other thing that happens is sometimes the stress of pruning will kill, or branches might be damaged or not really, thrive. And if you've done all of your pruning based on a plan or an intention you had for this, then the tree has a different plan based on how it reacted to the transplanting. So it's worth giving it just that year in the ground between, plant it, let it sit, let's see how it does, make sure it's actually going to stay there and live there, and then start making some decisions about pruning.
One more question about maples in pots before we move on from that is, do you need to change out the soil in a pot, or can you just leave the same soil?
You do need to change out the soil in a pot, but that's a course of like several years down the road. I mean, they can stay in pots. I've seen trees that have lived in pots for 5-6 years before they start to show any bad results from that. If it's a bonsai and you're going to be, or it's something that's going to be living in a pot forever, you are going to need to think about how you're going to do some root pruning to manage that too. So that's a whole other thing to talk about. But in general, if it's in a pot, it can live in that soil for 5-6 years before you have to really start thinking about doing anything. And it's worth thinking about then moving it to a larger pot as well, because as the top of the tree is growing, the roots are growing too. So that root mass that you're going to be moving is going to have to continue to live. If you're keeping it in the same pot, it's going to have to continue to live on those same resources in that same space for years. What you're eventually going to have is something where it's going to be so pot bound and root filled that there's just not going to be any room for new growth, and then your tree is going to stop growing. It may not die right away. It may die 5-6 years down the road after that. But at one point or another, it's going to cease thriving. So when you're doing that 5-6 years down the road, new soil, new pot. That's my recommendation.
Do you have any recommendations for particular pruning tools or brands?
I'm particular personally to Japanese tools. I find them to be sharper, easier to use. A lot of gardeners in the West like the Felco brand pruners, which are fine. I use those for years and years. One thing I will say is always make sure that when you're doing any kind of pruning, you want to use the bypass pruners. That's one where you have a hook and a blade, and the blade goes over the hook, as compared to the more like scissors, the way that they cut. As compared to when you'll see the anvil pruners, which are a blade that chops into a piece of soft steel or soft metal. Those are really, they don't last very long, and they tend to make very uneven cuts. A good pair of bypass pruners will make really, really clean cuts, and depending on which kind you get or what size you get, you're able to get really small points. You can make really detailed cuts. As far as brands, there's dozens available out there. I would say find something that you're going to be really comfortable with. Think about what feels good in your hands, and invest a little bit. Like all of your other tools, the more higher quality will give you better results in almost everything like that. So.
And is there anywhere that you would recommend getting tools cleaned or sharpened?
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't really know any place. I will say that I try to avoid cleaning or sharpening with a lot of petroleum distillate, especially the Japanese tools. The steel in those is extremely hard, and using something like a WD-40 or petroleum-based oils, that can actually pit some of that better higher quality carbon steel. So for my tools, for cleaning them, I use camellia oil. It's a plant-based oil that you can buy from Japanese garden suppliers, and it's a really great, really light oil that preserves the metal. It's a great lubricant, and it also removes the itch and sticky stuff off the bark, off the tools really well.
Well, I think we are running out of time for questions. There are so many more good ones, so I'm really sorry if we didn't get to yours. But I think we have one really good question here to end our evening on from Shondell. What do you wish someone would have told you when you first started working with maples?
I was really fortunate that I had somebody who told me a lot. I got a chance to work with Cass Turnbull when she was alive, and she was an amazing teacher that I think was really well known here in the Pacific Northwest. So I had some wonderful teachers and got a lot of great information. I think that I wish I had spent more time paying attention to the trees themselves and less time trying to figure out what people were telling me to do while I was pruning them. That's important. I think if you can observe so much and you can learn so much just by looking at how the trees are growing. What are they doing? We'll never make a tree prettier than a tree makes itself. We don't know how. They do. So trust the trees to be good at being trees. And if you do that, you're always going to be more successful.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending. If you enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider making a donation to the Seattle Japanese Garden. I'm going to share a link right now. Your support is what helps us put on these programs. And even a $10 donation would really make a difference, especially with the crazy year that everyone's been having. So thank you very much, Pete, for your time. And thank you everyone for attending. We will be wrapping up.
Thank you very much. Thanks.